Just to set the stage for how good was he and what is his legacy, before we talk about individual films and talk about your relationship personally, what was Fellini to mean to movie making?
I think in terms of filmmaking, this was, we can use the words giant and
master,
great light and
genius.
master, and there's Kurosawa, there's John Ford, there's Wells, and in that same sense there's Fellini. But Fellini had something very special, and it was a particular vision of the world that was at once started in a sense with poetic realism, in a way, with La Strada, and as it developed became somewhat more abstract in terms of its imagery, but ultimately very, very stylized, extremely stylized visual images. Yeah. But he created, unlike, I must say, probably more than anybody else, he created his own world.
Federico Fellini is an artist and visual storyteller in a league all his own. Entering into the world of Italian cinema at the height of the neorealist movement, a movement characterized by its gritty reality and honest portrayal of the working class, many of his early films were in some way influenced by the trends of the time. Some may even cite many of Fellini's early films as works of neorealism, but Fellini never seemed to fall in line with the ideas of neorealism. His view of reality always tended toward the bizarre and absurd, and he strayed further and further away from these ideas as his career continued. All of Fellini's films contain his signature blending of the fantastical and reality. Though still in their early stages, these ideas made their way into Fellini's early works, like The White Sheik and I Vitelloni. The presence of neorealism can definitely be felt within both of these films, as they both follow lower to middle-class families. It's only a few small points in the films that we are able to see the fantastical bleeding into reality. In The White Sheik, this mostly happens when our main character, Wanda, is with the titular White Sheik. Nothing about these scenes is overtly fantasy, but there is an inherent level of absurdity and dreamlike nature to each of them. In I Vitelloni, the fantasy aspects seem even more distant, but come full force at the very end of the film as Meraldo says his goodbyes to the small town life. As we move on in Fellini's filmography, we can see this fantasy element becoming more and more pronounced. Large parts of La Strada and Nights of Cabiria are surreal in many ways, or have some sort of dreaminess to them. In La Strada, this comes through in the lifestyle of the two performers living on the fringe, as well as in Gelsomini's demeanor and seeming supernatural powers. In Nights of Cabiria, this fantasy is again a little more subdued, but comes through in the outrageous situations Cabiria gets herself into, and just like I Vitelloni, right at the very end of the film. The thing that makes both of these films powerful examples of the diffusion of fantasy into reality is the performance given by Giulietta Messina. Her ability to overemphasize and amplify emotions not only make her a joy to watch on screen, but also add an uncanny effect and unique potency among Fellini's catalog. After years of perfecting his style and ability as a filmmaker, Federico Fellini released what are undoubtedly two of his greatest and most fantasy-centric films. In both of these films, the fantasy aspects are no longer relegated to a supporting role, and instead are as prominent, if not overpowering, when compared to the reality presented within. At their core, both films have two protagonists, with their fantasies and daydreams on full display. 8½ following a troubled director in the midst of a failing production as his own life is coming crumbling down around him. Many of Fellini's films contain autobiographical elements, and 8½ is no exception. In many ways, it's one of his most autobiographical, though Fellini himself asserts, "It is impertinent to call my films autobiographical. I have invented my own life. I have invented it specifically for the screen. I live to discover and create a film director. No more. And I can remember nothing else." The very nature of Fellini's insertion of his own life into film echoes this constant desire to merge fantasy and reality.
Dormi bene, creaturine. Giudice te.
Guido, dove dormi stanotte? È la notte che ritratti i movioci. Non avrei mica paura. Ma bisogna stare zitti. E il dottor Giustine guarderà scioci in un angolo e lei sarà tesoro. Coraggio, Guido, che deve entrare in ritmo e te. Te ricordi la parola? Asa, nisi, masa. Asa, nisi, masa. Asa, nisi, masa.
If 8½ is the ideal example of Fellini's blending of reality and fantasy, then Juliet of the Spirits is the two running wild. The film's central subject matter deals with involvement in the occult and supernatural. In this film, Fellini no longer separates out fantasy and reality, and instead lets the two dance together unrestrained as otherworldly visions take over Giulietta's world.
Eccoli. Ricominciano. Andate via. Andate via.
Donna Giulietta, ma che sta dicendo?
Niente, è un gioco, no?
Questo lo danni.
Sì.
E deve fumare di meno, e deve dar retta al suo dottore, Giulietta.
Fellini pushed the limits of what cinema could do, and remains one of the most influential filmmakers of all time. When asked about the future of the reality he explores in many of his films, he simply replied,
I think that even if this road maybe is dangerous, I think that when one has had the intuition or the feeling, or one has opened that little door, I don't think that he can come back.